Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. And today I want to explore a thought that can feel slightly uncomfortable. And because I'm someone who believes that we are responsible for our lives, right? We are responsible for our choices. But sometimes, and I'm sure like we all have felt that, you know, um, the reality is more complex, right? And I want to, explore this thought that why I feel like it can feel uncomfortable to admit. We'll talk about that later. But thought is that sometimes our lives are not shaped solely by our own decisions, by, our own choices, but significantly influenced by the decisions of others, right? Because we often hear, ideas about personal responsibility and taking control of our lives. And I agree with that in principle. I think it is also important to acknowledge a more complex reality because at different stages of life, especially when we are, kids or when we are younger, financially dependent on someone, or emotionally vulnerable, our ability to make independent choices can be limited. And in those situations, other people's decisions, whether made by parents, partners, or family members, can have a very real and lasting impact on the direction of our life's take. And this does not necessarily mean that we're powerless, but it does mean that our autonomy is at times constrained by circumstances. And what I find particularly interesting is not just the impact of those moments, but the way they shape our internal narrative over time. You know, when you repeatedly experience situations where your choices are overridden or unsupported, it's very easy to develop a subtle belief that your life is not entirely in your control. Even when circumstances begin to change, that belief can remain in the background, influencing how you respond to new situations. And another layer to this is the role of multiple people in decision making. And I've observed many people in my life as well. And in theory, having more people means having more perspectives, and it should lead to better decisions, it should lead to better outcomes. But in reality, what I have observed, especially in personal matters, the involvement of many people often leads to confusion. It leads to delay, it leads to emotional pressure as well, because each person brings their own expectations, their own fears and opinions. And if you're someone who is empathetic or highly sensitive, you may find yourself absorbing all of that, and instead of making a clear decision, now you start negotiating. You weigh everyone's emotions, you try to avoid conflict, and gradually you lose clarity about your own needs. And over time, this can create a pattern where your life feels less like a series of intentional choices and more like a series of adjustments. And there is also a physical and emotional cost to this. When you're constantly navigating expectations that don't align with your own capacity or desires, it creates internal tension. You may not always recognize it immediately, but it can manifest as fatigue, stress, even a sense of being overwhelmed without a clear reason. At the same time, I think it's important to avoid reducing this entire experience to blame, right? Because most people are not intentionally trying to control or harm us. They are acting from their own conditioning, their own fears, and their own understanding of what is right. Recognizing that can bring a certain level of compassion, but it should not come at the cost of your own well being. So, you see, there are three layers. First is in the first section, I tried to talk to you about, the times when your choices are limited, when you might not be able to, control a lot of things in your life. The second section focuses more on avoiding, that resentment and trying to be more compassionate. Everybody's trying to do their best. Not everybody's trying to harm you. They're trying to help you. And again, you you may not be helped by the help they provide, but it's at least, their intention, and they're trying to do the best they can from their own level of awareness. Now, the third section, which I think is very important. See, the question is not whether other people's decisions have influenced your life. They probably have at some point. The more important question is whether you continue to operate from those constraints, even when they are no longer fully present. Because at some stage, even if gradually, your capacity for choice begins to expand, you become an adult, right? You have the choice now. You may not have complete freedom because of, again, different circumstances, but you often have more agency than you realize. And if you're someone who doesn't know what this agency is, I have created an episode on sense of agency. You should go and check that. And it's like everything, I think, comes down to sense of agency. You know, the challenge is that exercising that agency requires a shift, not just externally, but internally. It requires you to question long held assumptions about what is possible for you. It requires you to tolerate discomfort, especially when your decisions do not align with other people's expectations. And perhaps most importantly, it requires you to take responsibility for the areas where you do, in fact, have a choice. This is where boundaries become essential, not as a form of rebellion, but as a form of clarity. Boundaries are not about cutting people off abruptly or proving a point. They are about gradually redefining what you are available for and what you're not. In practice, this can look very simple. It can be saying no without over explaining. It can be choosing not to engage in certain conversations. And the reason I said without over explaining, because it's because when you set boundaries, they have to make sense to you. They don't have to make sense to the other person. And sometimes, we try over explaining, we try justifying our boundaries. No, if you have the choice to set a boundary, you should set a boundary and you don't have to explain it to someone else, right? And another choice can be making a decision quietly without seeking approval from multiple people, right? So either setting a boundary or making a decision, or making a decision about that boundary. And these may seem like small actions, but over time, they shift the balance. Your life becomes less reactive and more intentional. And of course, this process is not immediate. When you start making these changes, there may be resistance from others, from within yourself. You may feel guilt, you may feel doubt, or even fear of consequences. And that is a natural part of the transition. But if you stay with it, something begins to stabilize. You start to experience a sense of ownership over your life, not because everything is in your control, but because you are actively participating in the decisions that shape it. That active participation matters. So perhaps a more grounded way to look at this is not to ask whether your life has been influenced by others, but to ask where your influence begins now, right in this moment. Is there an area where you are still waiting for permission that you no longer need? Is there a decision you have been postponing because it might disappoint someone? Is there a boundary that you recognize internally, but you have not expressed internally, or expressed externally yet? And these are not easy questions, but they are important ones, because once uh, while you may not have had complete control in the past, and you are not entirely without choice in the present as well, Do you see what I mean here? Like maybe in the past you didn't have complete control, but in the present, you still have the choice. You're not entirely without choice. And sometimes reclaiming your life does not come from one big decision, but from a series of smaller, consistent shifts in how you choose to respond each and every moment. One more layer that becomes very important in all of this is emotional regulation, which I really wanted to talk about, but maybe I'll talk about that in the next episode. Because even when your circumstances begin to change, even when you start having, more control over your life and you start to have, more agency, your ability to act on that agency depends heavily on how regulated you feel internally. If you're overwhelmed, if you're anxious, if you're emotionally triggered, it becomes much harder to make clear decisions. And in those moments, you're more likely to either comply, avoid, or react impulsively, none of which truly reflect your intention, you know? So even though technically you may have a choice, emotionally it may not feel like you do because of, the past conditioning. And this is why emotional regulation is not just a personal development concept, it's a practical skill that directly affects how much control you can exercise over your own life. Because when you are emotionally regulated, you create a small but powerful pause between what is happening around you and how you respond to it. The happening, the event, and the response. There is the space between these two. And in that space, you decide what to do, right? In that pause, you have options. You can choose not to agree immediately. You can choose not to explain yourself excessively. You can choose to take time before making a decision. And without that pause, without that space, it becomes very easy to fall back into old patterns. Patterns of, people pleasing, overthinking, simply, going along with what feels easier in the moment, and this is especially relevant if you are someone who is highly sensitive or emotionally aware. You don't just process your own emotions, you often absorb the emotional states of others. And when multiple people are involved with different expectations and opinions, it can become overwhelming very quickly. And in that overwhelmed state, your priority shifts from making the right decision to reducing discomfort. And that's where you may end up saying yes when you mean to say no, saying, uh, things you might regret later, or not saying something that you should have said, staying when you want to leave, or delaying decisions that you already know need to be made. So, in a way, emotional regulation is what allows your boundaries to actually function. It supports clarity, it supports consistency, and it allows you to respond from a place of intention rather than reaction. Now, this doesn't mean you will always feel calm or certain. That's not even realistic. But it does mean that over time, you become more capable of holding your emotions without letting them completely dictate your actions. And that changes how you show up in situations where other people's decisions or expectations are involved. Instead of feeling overpowered, you begin to feel more grounded. Instead of reacting immediately, you start responding more thoughtfully. And slowly, your decisions begin to reflect your own values, not just external pressure. And I think this is an area that deserves its own space because emotional regulation is not something you fix overnight. It's something you build gradually with awareness and practice. So in the next episode, I'll go deeper into this. I would love to talk about, emotional regulation, what it actually means in a practical sense, and how you can start developing it over time, especially if you tend to feel things very intensely, especially if you're a highly sensitive person, because once you understand that, it becomes much easier to take back control of your decisions, not in a forceful way, but in a steady and sustainable way.